This comes from lingo actually. Lalung means Shiva. Shiva in his holic form. They worship in the month of Baisakh. They say that this is the Baisagu, and they worship both bamboos and the Yoni Pitha. Worship both in the phallic forms and in the Joni Pitha in the Nalbari areas. So mainly in the Brahmaputra Valley, they worship Shiva in various forms like Bholanath, Maheshwara, Burha Gohai, Bhangura Gohai, Pogala Gohai, and they sing they sung various types of kirtanas and varieties of their stanzas. They said like I said, but this is the form of the this is all the this is all the forms of lingo worships actually. There is more than lingo worships are there, but all these are nirguna upasana is also there, and this is also found in the Shiva Purana Uma Samhita, where the Shakti worships are specially mentioned, and in the Kamakya Dham, Kalika Purana is followed. So, in the Assamese community, they said actually the poem is the stanzas in the Dharma Samhita. It is said that Otithi Risa Bhagnansa Grihat Prati Nirvartate Satasya Dushkritam Datta Punnamadaya Gachati. Actually, there is Atithi Pujana. After worshipping Shiva and Shakti, they offered food to the poor and others, and it is mentioned in the Dharma Samhita of the Shiva Purana. So this is many things are there, folic images, folic form of Shiva, Shiva rites and rituals in the month of Pu. This is Pushabhisheka. So all these are I have already mentioned in my paper, which is uploaded or website. So this is the gist actually, where Brahmaputra Valley. There is another ritual is also called Kavari. Kavari is the system of worship which originated in South India. In Assam, it is better known as Bolbom. Bolbom, and it is the main. It is another rituals of Brahmaputra Valley where Shiva and Shakti worshipped jointly. So this is, thank you so much, sir.
That's very thorough. Thank you, Banashri. There's lots of material there, and I'm sure those of us who've read the paper will have questions. Thank you for that. And so I'll turn now to Catherine, and who has uploaded a lovely video that we have watched. Catherine, would you like to provide a synopsis of the main content of that presentation?
Absolutely. So it's my tradition that I've studied for many years, excuse my voice, is Sri Vaishnavism in South India. And I've usually approached this tradition through textual study, but over 40 years, I went almost every year to South India. And therefore, you can see I'm having trouble with my voice. I apologize for that. So therefore, I hung around a lot in Sri Vaishnava circles. And about a decade ago, I decided that it was time to write about non-Brahmin Sri Vaishnavas. So why non-Brahmins? Sri Vaishnavism has been a Brahmanical tradition with its leadership of acharyas, jirs, and archakas in Brahmin positions. And yet this is a theology that claims to be caste inclusive, having absorbed the religion of the Alvars, the 7th to 9th century poet saints, into their liturgy and into the very core of the intellectual tradition through commentaries on these 4,000 verses or hymns. So I wanted to know, as we, oh dear, let me get a glass of water here. I wanted to know, as we moved into the modern period, where we had the massive non-Brahmin movement that protested Brahmin hegemony in so many different forms, how these non-Brahmin Sri Vaishnavas, being part of that tradition, but also non-Brahmins as part of that larger non-Brahmin movement, were experiencing this kind of cognitive dissonance between the religion and the politics. So that gave rise to a book of based on 40 interviews between about 2000 and 2015, where I did interviews in the area of Chennai, Pondicherry, Srirangam, a bit in the south. And from that, I began to discover, because I studied mainly the elderly. I think that happened by default, not by design, mainly because I was with an older crowd who were taking me to meet people. And I was an older person myself at this point. So I became interested in the elderly because I knew if no one had ever collected their stories, and they had never been written about, then that was really going to be lost to history. So in a sense, I was doing a history of, there's a few good phrases around, a history of the now and the history from below. So putting the present and the different voices together was taking me into some uncharted territory, so to speak. Anyway, my discussion with the elderly, they often told me about their family histories, which took them back to parents, to grandparents, and memories of the family tradition that went even further than that. And I began to notice some really interesting tales about colonial figures that had proposed quite a radical movement, and one that I had never known about, or I had never even read about. So I, for this paper, focused on 4 of these 7 colonial figures, the first coming from about 1831, right up into the post-independence period. And this particular family were Naidus, which had been elite landlords very often in the colonial period. Now, I was curious then. I had realized that they were Sanskrit knowers in this family. So I wanted to know why they wanted Sanskrit. So very simply, that question, that they wanted Sanskrit because the scriptures, the commentaries, especially on the scriptures, on their favorite poet, Alvar hymns, Alvars coming from several different non-Brahmin castes, were written in Manipravala, which was a combination of Tamil and Sanskrit. And so far, the Brahmins had always had the control of these scriptures because they had the control of the knowledge of Sanskrit through their Sanskrit schools. So to really have knowledge of the tradition, they needed, if they wanted to understand and approach the texts themselves, they needed Sanskrit. As a result, to get that Sanskrit, it happened in a very interesting way. there were two major Telugu mattas in this area. And the Jirs of those mattas, one of them, especially the Vananamalai Matta, which is in the extreme south of India, would teach Sanskrit to these several non-Brahmin Naidus who were sent there from their Jir at Tirukoyalur, which is in the vicinity of Pondicherry. So they got Sanskrit that way. The first one, Ramanuja Navalar, went on to translate 4 Puranas. So my question was, why Puranas? And I think it was because it was a matter of status, even in Brahmin poet leader circles, to translate Sanskrit Puranas that were coming into Tamil Nadu from about the 16th century, mainly as a result of a large northern migration of Brahmins into the area. So the Brahmins were creating actually Sanskrit Puranas, and these non-Brahmins wanted to do that as well. And their Jirs instructed them to. So Ramanuja Navalar did 4 of these Puranas, and then he did 46 independent works, treatises of Sri Vaishnava theology. And then his nephew was the next figure, Bhuvanagiri Ekangi Swamigal, and he also learned Sanskrit in much the same way. He became especially interesting to me because he began to initiate non-Brahmins, and that was a Brahmin Acharya role, strictly so, up to this point. How did he do that? He began to convert non-Brahmins. So the Sri Vaishnavas were interested in conversion because there was lots of conversions to Christianity and Buddhism, and in general, Sri Vaishnavas wanted to maintain their non-Brahmin base and even their Dalit base, which was important for labor in their areas, and for some issues of justice that were arising at the same time. So he proselytized with the Dalits, among others, and then he asked his Jir, his Brahmin Jir, to initiate them, which was part of becoming a bona fide Sri Vaishnava in a sense. And the Jir, I think, did not want to touch him, even though the branding part of the fivefold ritual of Panchasamskara, even though that branding was on a stick, the Brahmin Jir refused to do that and asked the non-Brahmin Bhuvanagiri Ekangi Swamigal to do it. And then Bhuvanagiri decided, well, if he was doing that part of the ritual and he had the Sanskrit and the knowledge and the proper behavior of a Sri Vaishnava, he could be an Acharya. And he argued anyone who had the requisite expertise and behavior, whether a Shudra or a woman, presumably an outcast as well, a Dalit, should be able to do this. And he went all over Tamil Nadu preaching about this. I mean, he combined it with Harikathas. It was a very popular form of Vidya. And he proselytized in this manner, got into terrible fights with Brahmins who didn't like this, with Shaivas, with Christians, because he was also claiming that every religion was real and true, and one needed not to convert, and so forth. So that's the second big story, and I'll just very quick, stop going on a long time now. The third big story is his nephew, B.R. Purushottama Naidu, who became a very famous South Indian scholar. Now, what's interesting is because of the development of the departments of Tamil, the Sri Vaishnavas who had some Sanskrit and Tamil, instead of going into Sanskrit departments, they were hired in these new Tamil government universities. And Purushottama Naidu started out in government college in Tanjore, but eventually he was in the Tamil department at the University of Madras. So to sum this up, these are just traces. I had to work very hard to learn about these figures. They had basically disappeared from history. And so I found brochures. There's some temples to them. I went to their samadhis. I tried to trace their literature, their works that they had written, and much of it had been lost. So that became a chapter in my book that came out last year about these interviews. I've put it up. Turbulent transformations. And it was a very important, neglected aspect of colonial history. A lot's been written on Shaivism, on Christianity, on Neo-Buddhism, but this certainly had not been written about. And the interviews are absolutely fascinating to see what that interface is between religion, caste, and politics, and also the Telugu component in Sri Vaishnavism and how that played into this particular story. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. That's fantastic. Thank you, Catherine. And I hope to see that book finding its place in the new books panel or sections of the conference. There are places to.
I need to know. I need to know how to do that. I need to know how to do that.
I think the main idea is to attend there. I believe there are 2 sessions that are at very different times for different time zones, where one can attend and make very short presentations of one's new publications, or since the last World Sanskrit Conference 2018. But yes, this is fascinating work, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. And again, what I'd like to do is in the first round, to encourage our participants to direct questions each for each other. And then I see there are some in the chat box that have appeared already, but why don't we first begin with, in any order at all, does anyone have a question for your fellow panelists? Yes, Kyoka's, yes.
Can you hear me? Am I audible? Okay. Yes, so I already put my questions in the presenter chat section, but maybe since Anusha went first, maybe I ask you first my 2 questions. So the first question I had was this SVA. What was it? It was a Swapna. I forgot the A is Akhyana or something, I guess. But the V I forgot.
Swapna Vrindavan Akhyana.
Oh, okay, Swapna Vrindavan Akhyana. And then you mentioned that this is a very corrupted text, and you explain or your analysis or your thoughts on this. That is, maybe this is very corrupted text because this is a sort of narration based on dream. So this Brahmin, otherwise deaf Brahmin would just have this narration in dream, but then he narrates in the daytime, but then maybe he forgets. So, but that interpretation is very much based on, maybe what the text itself tells about the nature of the text. But then I was wondering, maybe it's corrupted simply because the manuscript transmission is not very good. So I just wondered that if in what form have you looked at this text, and then have you looked at any manuscript at all, or is this printed text from the beginning? I don't know. So just something about the textual transmission of this text, the SVA. That was the first question. And second question was that yes, so your sort of one of the main argument is that this Vadiraja Tirtha is sort of initiated or kind of venturing into sort of unique direction in the development of Matva tradition by kind of trying to reach out and incorporate the, let's say, local or indigenous worship of spirit. And then you mentioned that then this is not without precedence, that actually Matva himself did something similar. But then as an example or as evidence to show that Matva himself did something already in like Vadiraja did, you mentioned this hagiography, and then how this, according to this, one of the earliest, I think it was Matva Vijaya, according to this one of the earliest hagiography, there is a reference to this man who climbed up the tower and then sort of proclaimed that this wonderful person, i.e. Madhvacharya, is coming to earth to save us and then give us grace and so on. And then I think you give this as an example of how yeah, some sort of like outlandish practice that is I think that was an example of like how do you call this, the spirit taking over someone, and then that's why this person could do something which normal human being wouldn't have been able to do. But then that example is based on Madhva Vijaya, and then it's not from Madhva's writing itself. So I was just wondering, and then that example is also not really about what Madhva himself did, even according to hagiography. So I was just wondering if there is any place in Madhva's writing itself, or even like hagiographical information, but about Madhva Acharya's activity itself that indicate that you know, he was perhaps interested in reaching out or kind of including indigenous local practices. So these were two questions. I hope they make sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Those are both great questions. I'll perhaps answer them in the same order that you asked them in. So the first, about the text itself, I should qualify the word corrupt, which I was looking forward to a chance to doing in the discussion. So that's a great question. I believe that the manuscript itself is not corrupt. I've looked at multiple editions of the text, and I plan to look at the manuscripts as well when I next travel to India. But what I mean by corrupt here is that I'm talking about the text as corrupt in how it emerges from the speaker. So it's an inbuilt feature of the text that's difficult to explain. So let me give an example. So there are specific portions in the text when Vadiraja, or the speaker who claims to be Vadiraja, is addressing the Brahmana who is dumb and has never spoken before. And he says, "Oh Brahmana, I told you this particular verse which you forgot to narrate earlier. So tell the scribe to note it down now." And this is part of the text itself. So if you look at the metrical structure of the text, because it's in meter, you see Anushtup verses, there is no problem with the meter itself. So when I spoke of corruption in the text, it's not only at the level of the manuscript, but it's at the level of transmission from the speaker to the scribe, which the text itself is repeatedly acknowledging, that here is this Brahmana who has never spoken before, and now he's re-narrating from a dream, but he's bound to forget things which he gets scolded for within the text itself. Of narrative in the text, which also gives the text the opportunity to make further modifications. You see Vadiraja instructing people within Sonda about certain petty crimes that were committed, certain thefts and reparations that must be performed, and so on. So the text is perfectly readable. It's just there's also Anvaya Klesha. It's difficult to construe it syntactically. But the meter is intact, and the corruption seems to be more at the level of transmission from the speaker who is talking verbally to the scribe, who is still accomplished because he's the writer of a hagiography also. So it's not really the fault of the person claiming to be the scribe. the scribe authored the hagiography, and in the hagiography he acknowledges being the scribe of this Swapna Vrindavana Akhyana. As to the second question you raised, also really interesting. Thank you so much. So the reason I quoted from the Madhva Vijaya is because we see this mention of spirit possession within the Madhva Vijaya. And when you look at instances of phenomena like this, you're unlikely to find them in Vedanta texts, as I'm sure you're familiar with. So those would be restricted to commentaries on the text itself. And when we look at Vadiraja's work too, we do not talk about spirit worship or any Taulava practice outright. They do want to maintain the authenticity of the tradition, and they claim to not be innovating, but to be drawing from precedents within the tradition itself. However, it is still possible for us to look back at Madhvacharya's texts to point out to instances where he might be responding to local practices. So I think Valerie Stoker has done this really well. I'm not sure of any articles, but in two of her presentations, she's spoken about how Madhva is trying to bring in local practices. I think particularly important to me is hierarchy itself that you have discussed in your paper too. And I think the very phenomenon of this doctrine of hierarchy, where you rank various deities, it allows for a certain negotiation with local traditions. So Tulunadu, as we know, was a predominantly Shaiva place, coastal Karnataka, which is why you have these folk practices too, which were Shaiva. So within the Madhva doctrine, Shiva occupies a very important place. He directs the mind. He's one of the greatest devotees of Vishnu, and he should be worshipped. But within the framework of Dvaita Vedanta, he is subordinated to both Vayu and to Vishnu. And therefore, there are only specific ways in which you must pray to him to grace you, and not in other ways. So we see Madhva do this too repeatedly, and Vadiraja has his precedents in Madhva himself. So at the end of my paper, I've pointed to just one instance in the Tirtha Prabandha of Vadiraja, but we can find many where he talks about praying to various gods, Shiva, Skanda, various gods, but all within the framework of the Madhva system, only in accordance with the importance they hierarchy, and never as the supreme god. So I think this is a good instance of trying to negotiate with practices and forms of worship that are already existent. There was also some work done in India recently on the role of the Subramanya Matha in the community. So even this Udupi region, which is known for Skanda or Subramanya worship, has a role to play within the Madhva tradition. Of course, we can see this all much more in the ritual practices of the Madhvas rather than textually. But I think we can extrapolate from that evidence when we look back at the text. That's both your questions.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you very much. And then yeah, I have a response or continuation, but yeah, let's keep that for later, and yeah, maybe others can.
Great, thank you, Anusha. And I'm having a little trouble navigating the presenter chat. I have this presenter chat screen here. My impression is that, Anusha, perhaps you had a question for Banashri. Is that right?
I mean, I did have questions for all the speakers, but I think someone else had posted that was in the audience.
Okay.
I want to look at that.
Sure. Okay. Perhaps I'll come to that in a minute. I do want to sort of give the presenters the opportunity to each converse a little with each other. Does anyone have a question for Catherine or Banashri? Yes, Catherine.
Following on our conversation. So I'm wondering if we think of Hinduism as constantly in a process of integrating local traditions. I think every single region has this, every sectarian community has this. So why at this particular point in time do the Madhvas decide to integrate the spirit worship? Had that been done by any other group in that region? Or was this simply a way of bringing in a certain community that was of interest to this Madhva orientation? Were there political reasons? Why at this moment? The strategy is fairly well known with iterations and variations, but why now? Can't hear.
Sorry, Anusha, I think you are muted.
Oh, thank you so much. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. That's a great question. So one of the first things to think about is when this spirit worship tradition started in this particular format in the Taulava region at all. And we would that according to inscriptions and the work of Dr. Chinnappa Gowda to sometime during the Vijayanagara period. So it's not that long before Vadiraja that we see documented evidence kind of practice. And when it comes to spirit worship, like you said, this practice of adopting local traditions is a part of all sectarian communities. But since spirit worship itself is pretty recent, and with Vadiraja, we see a shift in the policies that he's adopting with regard to expanding influence of the tradition. So when Vadiraja is operating, the Vijayanagara Empire has disintegrated into these little Nayaka kingdoms. And so he's looking at kingship at a much smaller scale, and he needs patronage from various different groups, which are following, say, Veera Shaiva practices. He needs the support of local people even more because he does not have the same kind of royal grants that someone like Vyasatirtha, who had an important role to play within the Vijayanagara Empire, does. So within his work particularly, I also think another thing that contributes to Vadiraja's intellectual project is that he seems to be continuing along making Madhva religion more Taulava in nature, as opposed to the impulse of thinkers like Jayatirtha and Vyasatirtha, who are trying to make Madhva Vedanta more pan-Indian, more doctrine based, using their technical commentaries on philosophical texts. So his approach seems to be different. He's looking at a much more local, regional audience, also because of his political situation. So for all these reasons, I think that spirit worship becomes an important cultural practice during this juncture, for one. So this is why he is, even if not Vadiraja directly, we see immediately after him, they take on his vernacularization project. After all, we don't see Vadiraja mention Bhutaraja himself. But soon after him, we see Vadiraja incorporated into this vernacularization project and an attempt to bring in spirit worship into Dvaita Vedanta.
Could I have one last question here?
Sure. Yeah.
Do you think that has anything to do with the fact that the Vijayanagar Empire is trying to create inroads into the south? And even though they're not doing that directly here, because the sects such as the Madhvas, the Sri Vaishnavas, and others are trying to create this this basis and this extension, and there's competition among them, that this had some downward effect and inspired a more regionalization and localization.
I think it definitely has something to do with the political situation, but I'm not sure if that is fostered by competition between the Sri Vaishnavas and the Madhvas in this instance. There's definitely a need for competing with other sects for patronage from these local Nayaka kingdoms, which have appeared after the Vijayanagara Empire. But I think Vadiraja mainly addresses the Jain community, which seems to be very powerful in this region. And the Veera Shaivas, who have quite a few royal patrons. So I think these are the two main sects that he's addressing his polemics most vociferously against. But that definitely does play a role, the need to attract a larger audience to Vedanta.
And the play of Rama in the Vijayanagar Empire gets then picked up in the Vaishnava traditions and highlighted.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's abundantly clear, particularly with Vyasatirtha, who was, and Hanuman, of course, is an important figure in the Madhva tradition. So that comes to be even more important with the establishment of various Hanuman idols and temples by Vyasatirtha.
Wonderful, thank you. Perhaps I will go over
We have
to
another
the...
question
Oh, I'm sorry.
from Kyo Kazu to Professor Young.
Wonderful, yes. Kyoku, did you want to ask something, Catherine? A
Oh, yeah,
question?
sure. Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes. Thank you for your wonderful presentation and many congratulations on the publication of your latest book. I look forward to receiving the hard copy. So yeah, a few questions, well, actually many questions, but some of them I wanted to ask here. I just wondered that you know, when you talk about this non-Brahmin Vaishnavas sort of trying to receive Sanskrit education, I'm just wondering, and then you mentioned the sort of Tengalai influence, perhaps of not so much emphasizing this Brahmin, non-Brahmin distinction. You mentioned that, but then I also wonder that if there was any sort of influence of colonial education in general, that maybe there was sort of general, I guess, maybe Western influence of egalitarianism. Do you see that influence coming in some ways? That was my first question. And the second question, you mentioned that these non-Brahmin, the Sri Vaishnavas, they approached that Sanskrit text and translated the Stala Puranas and the how that was sort of related to the interest of like establishing the temple authority and so on. That makes sense. But then I also wonder that if this non-Brahmin Vaishnavas approach to translate the Vedantic works of Ramanuja or Yamunacharya and so on. I ask this because I study Bengali Vaishnava tradition, and there is also not exactly the same, but something parallel, that is non-Brahmin acharyas initiating Brahmin disciples and so on. But then some scholars claim that at least within the context of Bengali Vaishnavas, these non-Brahmin Vaishnavas did not sort of compose Vedantic works. They produce poetry, they produce commentary and so on, but they did not produce like Vedantic works as such. So I was just wondering that other than Stara Puranas, translating Stara Puranas, did they translate some of the Vedantic works? And lastly, you mentioned that this non-Brahmin Vaishnavas had interest in sort of keeping the non-Brahmin followers of Sri Vaishnavism. That is, that they saw the Christianity and Neo-Buddhism as a sort of rivals. And then when you say Neo-Buddhism, I just wondered like what exactly you mean by Neo-Buddhism. And then I was just wondering if that refers to Ambedkarites. These were three questions that I had. Thank you.
Okay, a lot to talk about here. So where do I begin? Well, you may have to prompt me on these questions again. Let's go back to the equality issue. And first of all, it's so thoroughly there as a key motif in the Sri Vaishnava theology. So there's lots of equality talk, there's lots of reversal symbolism. Malvar said, even the servants of the servant shall be my master. And this gets into the concept of canon, it gets into the very core of the theology. Now the question is, how much of this theology, oh, I'm so sorry about my voice. Maybe it's getting up so early in the morning. So how much of this theology is really translated into social action? How much is rhetoric? How much is practice? And there's a story of a non-Brahmin leader. Oh, gee, sorry. There's a story of one non-Brahmin, of Ramanuja, asking a non-Brahmin to be his teacher. And the non-Brahmin refuses. Okay, so there you've got the idea that they're open to this, but it never comes into effect. That's just one story. Now, by the time we get to the colonial period, there is definitely an influence that's coming via new education, by opening up spaces, secularizing spaces, all that that we know about the colonial transformations going on. Even though there was still the issue of slavery, there's also from 1870 a very strong Dalit mobilization, and now changes made to improve Dalit lives and so forth. The Sri Vaishnavas, especially the Tengalais, are in conflict at this time with the Vartigalais, and they're very interested in gaining control of the Tengalais are very interested in gaining control of the temples. And to do that, they need patronage, they need a strong base. They already had a great deal of temple control, and many of the Vartigalais had gone to Karnataka in the 17th to 18th century, and they came back, but they had lost grounding, so to speak. Okay, so we get this interest of bringing non-Brahmins and Dalits, in a sense, into Sri Vaishnavism, and a lot of the acharyas went out and preached to them and converted them, and that's where my non-Brahmin story comes in. So there have been very, very low, especially in the Telugu community, very, very low literacy, okay, and no leadership positions. So as education comes in from these different directions, that starts to improve the non-Brahmin position. But the fact that now they could preach because they knew both their Sanskrit and their Tamil and could translate the Mani Pravala gave them the status of being educated and leaders. They weren't really accepted by the Brahmins, but they gained this status, which became extremely important in the many non-Brahmin castes and communities. Okay, so that's education. Now, what else did you want me to speak about? All your questions here. Let's see if I can.
If the non-Brahmins, they translated any Vedantic work.
Okay, my problem is that we're losing all these works that they wrote. There were 46 works written by this Ramanuja Navalar, and I went in and out of libraries trying to find them, and most of them can't be found now. I wish somebody would do a thesis on this, because maybe they're there, but it's only when we open them up and see exactly what these works are, will we see if there are Vedantic works in there. I don't think they would have been translating Vedanta Deshika because they were Tengalais. But they certainly were probably, they were translating and a lot of commentary on Acharya Hridayam, which is one, which was by Pillai Lokacharya's brother. Okay, so that would be a major theologian. They were certainly translating the commentaries on the hymns of the Alvars, and that's a huge corpus. and all the commentaries on the Tiruvayambali. So this Purushottam Naidu, who became eventually the professor in the Tamil department at Madras, he brought out, I believe, a 10-volume set of Sri Vaishnava works. And that what they were doing now, I don't think they were interested in Sanskrit learning per se. It was a means to an end to get to the scripture, to understand their religion. And then the next thing was to simplify that Manipravala, esoteric language, so to speak, into easy Tamil. And the translation then was going from that into easy Tamil. And then thanks to the printing press and a lot of support of non-Brahmin publishers, bringing out editions of these works in this form of easy Tamil. So my colonial figures were the key transition to this process that eventually democratizes the religion and creates enormous accessibility.
Wonderful.
Sorry, I had a related question, if I may.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Professor Yang. So I was really curious about two things particularly. One is the reception of these three figures that you're looking at to Ramanuja's own work. So how do they read his work as either being inclusive of various castes in terms of prapatti or in terms of the contentious passages in scripture that limit access of, say, Vedic texts to certain caste groups? So that was one question. And the second was, you mentioned, it was very interesting, and most of these figures have been deified in some way. I was wondering if they're the sense of temples or religious institutions honoring them and temples being constructed for them, or is there actually some mention of them having some being divine incarnations or having some divine origin which then justifies granting them access to these texts and to Vishishtadvaita Vedanta in general?
Okay, good question. So the deification, I think, is at a fairly local level. Well, local and caste level. So, for example, the temple at the birthplace of Ramanuja Navalar, just north of Pondicherry, was in a Naidu village. The Naidus have mainly left now, and it's largely Yadava. That is a temple that was set up and run by a certain Birlai family who were Sri Vaishnavas. And they sponsor it. They support the priests, the running of the temple. There's a festival on Ramanuja Navalar's birthday. There are images, you saw the images of him. So it's localized, and it is related to family and caste that supports it. The same thing with Bhuvanagiri to a lesser degree. Family traditions come into Sri Perambadur, where Samadhi is, and fix it up every year, and there's some rituals, etc. One of the things I think that happened is that non-Brahmins never had an independent institutional base. Okay, they were disciples of acharyas and of jirs. Those are mainly Brahmanical institutions. But outside in small temples and villages all through Tamil Nadu, there were non-Brahmin priests, okay, and minor leaders, but no institutions that bridged the broader non-Brahmin identity. So, I don't know, am I answering your question here?
Yes, that makes sense. So am I right in understanding that the worship of these figures seems to be local and also rooted in their own caste rather than within Sri Vaishnavism?
I mean, it's located in Sri Vaishnavism because they use Sri Vaishnava identity, and they have rituals on all of these occasions where they chant the hymns of the avatars. And they always have speakers who talk about Sri Vaishnava theology and carry on that intellectual tradition. And the caste groups have now large networks because they're also plugging into the to the upward mobility and the government welfare systems, etc., and they get organized for that. So these networks get connected with these kind of ritualized events at temples, but very often sabha organizations.
I see.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We still have 45 minutes, which is wonderful. I am going to turn to the participant chat box now for a question for Banashri, and I think this is the earliest one that was posed. So there are several questions here. I don't think we'll have time for them all, but there's a question from David Bukta for Banashri. Your thesis is that the Shiva Purana influenced the development of Shaiva religiosity in Assam, but the specific examples of Shaiva practice in Assam that you cite are local traditions not recorded in the Shiva Purana, such as the Bihu. Is there any concrete evidence of the prominence of the Shaiva Purana, of the Shiva Purana in Assam? Are there practices specific to the Shiva Purana that you can point to as prevalent in Assam, especially before the 18th century? There's more. I'll continue. Can you cite, for example, anything from the Shiva Purana corresponding to the Shiva Parvati marriage celebration as practiced in Assam? So a few questions for you there, Banashri.
In the month of Po, this is the month actually January 9th, the marriage rituals of Shiva and Parvati are performed in Kamakya Dham, Assam. And the marriage rituals is mentioned in the Vaishnavism Samhita of the Shiva Purana, and Kalika Purana also they are mentioned the marriage rituals, but especially in the Shiva Purana, Vaishnavism Samhita mentioned the marriage rituals of Shiva and Parvati's in the month of Posha. So it is mentioned.
Yes, and is it used? Are there sections that are sort of liturgically performed, or is there a direct usage of those passages of Shiva Purana in the local rituals?
Actually, there is in the Kailasha Purana, Kailasha Samhita of the Shiva Purana, there are also an evidence. Actually, I mentioned a little bit here, but actually Bihu, there is three types of Bihus in the month of April, in the month of January, and in the month of November actually. So in the January it is called Mag Bihu, where Bhogali it is called. So lots of foods are prepared in this, and in the month of April this is called Ronga. It is the rituals of the performing the welcoming the new year of the Bengali or Assamese community. And in the November it is called Kati Bihu, where only lightening the lamp and they worship the bamboo tree as a symbol of Shiva.